She had been counting days by the hunger. Not the gnaw of it, she was past feeling that anymore, but the rhythm. The slow contraction in her belly every morning like a fist tightening and then unclenching. That was how she measured time in the dark. 37 fists. 37 mornings since the Velkith had thrown her into the undercroft and sealed the hatch above with a resonance lock she could hear humming through 2 meters of compressed stone. Her name was Persia Ironmaw, and she was the last daughter of the Ironmaw line, and she had no intention of dying in this hole. She pressed her back against the far wall, rough-hewn obsidian, warm from the geothermal vents below, and breathed through her nose the way her father had taught her when she was 4 years old and afraid of thunderstorms. In through the nose. Count to 6. Out through the mouth. Count to 8. The storm is just air. Air can't hurt you. You are Ironmaw. We were forged in fires that would kill the air itself. Her father, Commander Drek Ironmaw, greenskin warlord of the Barak Holds, 3-time survivor of the Kronith Purges, dead now for 11 years at the hands of the same court that had locked his daughter in this pit. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried since she was 14. What she did was push herself upright, roll her shoulders once, and begin moving. The cell was 12 paces long and 7 paces wide. She had measured it obsessively that first week, pressing her palm to each wall and counting, mapping the space with her fingers in the dark until she knew it the way you knew the inside of your own mouth. She ran its perimeter now, barefoot on stone, not jogging but moving with deliberate purpose, keeping her muscles from going entirely to ash. The Velkith had taken her weapons when they'd stripped her of rank. They'd taken her rank badge, her unit insignia, the small ceramic pendant she'd worn since her mother's funeral. They had not taken her body. They had not taken the 43 years of living that had built it. That had been their miscalculation. It was not a small one. She ran, she breathed, she counted. Somewhere above her, in the vaulted ceremonial halls of the Velkith Dominion's war seat on Keth Primaris, a decision was being made. She could feel it in the way the guards had stopped sliding rations through the lower slot. No food for 3 days meant someone had given an order, and orders given about prisoners in solitary were one of 2 kinds: release or execution. The fact that she was still breathing suggested they hadn't decided yet, or that someone was arguing on her behalf. She couldn't decide which possibility was less likely. She stopped at the north wall and pressed her ear to it. Nothing, the familiar subterranean moan of the vents. Somewhere far above, the barely audible vibration of the orbital cannons running their maintenance cycle. She had learned to read that sound like a language, had used it to track the station's rotational schedule. 28-hour cycles. She was in the 7th hour of the current one. She found the crack in the north wall. It had taken her 19 days to find it. A hairline fracture running diagonally from hip height to ceiling, no wider than the edge of her thumbnail, but she had traced it with her fingertips every day since, and she was certain, almost certain, that it ran through to the outer conduit channel. The geothermal conduits were the station's circulatory system. They ran beneath and around every structural section of the undercroft, piping heat from the planetary core to power the resonance locks. The resonance locks that kept her in. She had a piece of metal. She had taken it from the ration slot itself, a small bar that had come loose from the hinge mechanism sometime in week 2. She had been saving it, sharpening it in slow, patient passes against the seam between 2 floor stones. It was not a weapon. It was a tool. A thin, flat tool she had spent 11 days making precise enough to fit inside a resonance lock's secondary release channel. The problem was getting to the lock. The lock was on the other side of the door. She put the piece of metal in her mouth, a habit from her unit days, keeping your hands free, hiding tools where they won't be patted down, and stood very still in the dark, thinking. The Velkith understood Orcs the way they understood most things they had conquered, through the lens of what they needed them to be: useful, categorized, filed under a taxonomy that left no room for what didn't fit. 300 years of Dominion historiography had settled on an image of the Orc people that served the Dominion's purposes admirably. Large bodies, blunt impulses, reliable soldiers, unreliable administrators, not subtle, not patient, not given to the kind of sustained strategic thinking that separated civilization from savagery. The fact that this image required ignoring significant contradictory evidence was not a problem for the Velkith. They were excellent at ignoring contradictory evidence. Her father had told her once that this belief was the single greatest strategic advantage the Iron Maw line possessed. Let them think you're the hammer, Persia. The nail knows the hammer is coming. Nobody foresees the architect. She had been the architect in her time. She had commanded the 14th Greenskin Reconnaissance Corps for 6 years before the political winds had shifted. Before the Dominions, internal factional alignments had reshuffled, and the list of officers requiring loyalty review had included, for the first time in a long career, her name. She had known it was coming. Had known, in the specific way you knew things you had been carefully not knowing for a long time, when the knowing finally became impossible to delay. Had spent her last 48 hours of freedom, the 48 hours between seeing her name on the review list and the arrival of the interdiction net, doing nothing but memorizing. Station schematics, contact frequencies, hidden relay coordinates, the private codes of people she trusted enough to call from a position of no leverage at all. It was not the behavior of someone who expected to be exonerated. It was the behavior of someone who expected to need it all later. The interdiction net had caught her ship 3 jumps out, stripped its navigation capability, deposited her here. 37 days. She took the metal tool from her mouth and turned it in her fingers, feeling its weight and thinness, and the slight rough edge she had put on one side over 11 days of patient work. The crack in the north wall, the conduit channel beyond. She knew from the schematics she had memorized, specific, intentional memorization, not the soft retention of casual familiarity, but the hard crystalline encoding of someone who had decided this information was survival, that the geothermal conduit channel ran past the outer face of this cell block, before looping up to the resonance lock junction, the junction that controlled the lock on her door. If she could get into the channel, she could reach the junction. If she could reach the junction, the tool in her hand could trip the secondary release. And if the secondary release tripped, the lock would default to manual, a failsafe built into the system by engineers who understood that resonance locks failing in an emergency were more dangerous than an open door. There were 47 variables between where she was standing and where she needed to be. She had accounted for 43 of them. The other 4 she would deal with as they came. She began to work on the crack. It took hours. She didn't think about the hours. She thought about the angle of the tool, the precise depth of each pass, the faint granular texture of the stone giving way in slow increments. Obsidian fractured along predictable lines if you knew what you were asking of it. She knew. She had spent 3 years in geothermal mining operations as a young corporal before being scouted for reconnaissance, and she had learned then that rock was not an obstacle. Rock was a conversation. You didn't beat it. You listened for the direction it wanted to go, and you asked it firmly to go there a little faster. The Velkith engineers who had built the Undercroft had been competent. They had tested the walls for conventional tool impact, for heat application, for resonant frequency that might compromise structural integrity. They had not tested them for a woman with a hinge bar the size of her finger and 19 days of meticulous observation about where the rock was already tired. Around the 16th hour of work, she hit the conduit channel wall. It was different material, a composite polymer insulation layered over the conduit piping, and it gave differently under her tool, softer, warmer. She shifted her angle and adjusted pressure, and the heat coming through was significant now, pressing against her face and forearms like a slow, warm hand. She breathed through it. In through the nose, count to 6. The heat was not a problem. The heat was information. It told her she was close to the junction. When the gap was wide enough, she put her left arm through. Her shoulder scraped. She had lost enough weight in 37 days that it went barely, bruisingly, with a slow, careful torque that scraped skin off the top of her shoulder against the rock edge. And then her arm was inside the channel, and the heat wrapped around it completely. She felt left and right until she found what she was looking for, the lateral pipe junction running upward toward the lock assembly. Rough welded, imprecise, Velkith engineering was good but never excellent. They prioritized operational speed over finish quality, always had, and with her fingers she could trace the pipe like a map. She pulled her arm out, she breathed. She turned the problem of the secondary release mechanism over in her mind, examining it from every angle, finding the approach. Then she went back in. She worked for another 3 hours. Her shoulder was bleeding by the end of it, not seriously, surface cuts. She cataloged them the way she cataloged everything, noted and filed under manageable. And the heat in the channel had done something unpleasant to her forearm that she would feel properly tomorrow, if there was a tomorrow that included adequate rest. She felt the release mechanism click under her tool. The change in the resonance lock's hum was immediate and distinct, from a steady tone to a brief discordant chirp to silence. She pulled her arm out, stood upright, crossed to the door in 4 strides and pressed her palm flat against it. It moved. It swung outward on its hinges with the heavy, deliberate motion of something that had not been opened in 37 days, and she stood in the doorway and looked out into the corridor for a long second, taking it in. Empty, dimly lit, the amber indicator on the lock panel glowing the calm amber of a manual release. She breathed once more, in through the nose, count to 6. Then she went. The guard who came down the corridor at the start of the 8th hour was named Kethavar, and he had been a dungeon warden for 19 years, and he had never once had a prisoner escape from the Undercroft. He was aware of this fact in the self-satisfied way that people become aware of their clean records, not as an active thought, but as a kind of comfortable furniture in the back of the mind. It was simply true. The way that the sun rising over Keth Primaris was true, the way that the resonance locks were impregnable. Some things were simply facts of the universe. He rounded the corner to the Orc cell and stopped. The door was open. Not forced, not broken. The resonance lock's indicator panel glowed the calm amber of a manual release, as if someone had tripped the secondary failsafe from inside the conduit junction, which was not possible, which was a fact of the universe. He stood there for 3 full seconds, looking at the amber glow. Then he touched his communicator. Undercroft to command, the prisoner. He never finished the sentence. He was, instead, thinking about what he was going to say when, from the shadows to his left, shadows that had not been there a moment ago, shadows that turned out to be a large figure pressed flat against the corridor wall in a way that suggested someone who had spent time in reconnaissance. Something came out of the dark and hit him with the kind of professional precision that rendered the rest of the night unimportant to him. She caught the communicator before it hit the floor. She held very still, listening. No alarms, not yet. She looked down at the guard. Breathing, he was breathing. She had calibrated the strike carefully. She had not come this far to start killing her way out. She had no desire to kill her way out. Violence was a last option, not a first instinct, no matter what the Velkith histories wrote about Orc combat disposition, and then looked at the corridor. Left, the lift shafts guarded. Right, the maintenance tunnel access, her original exfiltration route based on the schematics in her head. Straight ahead, the secondary security post, currently unmanned because the first shift rotation hadn't completed. She had 12 minutes before the shift completed. She went straight ahead. The first person she encountered who wasn't a guard was a technician named Veloci, small-boned and Velkith, who was sitting in the secondary security post eating something from a container and reading something on a handheld screen, and who looked up when Persia walked through the door with the absolute expression of someone who had not been briefed on the possibility of orcs today. Persia took in the room in approximately 1 second. One exit behind her, one ahead. No alarm panel within the technician's immediate reach. The communicator console was on the far wall, which meant 3 steps minimum. She was currently 0 steps away from the technician. "You're going to tell me," Persia said, keeping her voice level and quiet and approximately the temperature of cold rock, "where the docking tier is from here. And then you're going to stay in that chair and count to 1,000 before you touch that communicator panel. And you are going to do these things because I have your guard's communicator and I have 12 minutes and you have, I suspect, no strong feelings about dying for the Velkith Dominion today." The technician looked at her, looked at the communicator in her hand, looked at her general size and the 37 days of contained, methodical purpose visible in every line of her body, and the expression on her face that was not angry. Anger would have been less frightening, but was instead just extremely, completely focused. "Tier 7, the technician said. "3rd junction, left corridor, service lift to the orbital dock." "Count," Persia said. She was in the corridor before the technician reached 3. The orbital docking tier smelled like coolant and hot metal, and the specific ozone bite of recirculated ship atmosphere, and Persia had never in her life been so glad to smell anything. She moved through it with the long, unhurried stride she'd developed over years of operating in places where running attracted attention and calm authority repelled it. She was barefoot, wearing the rough-spun prisoner's wrap the Velkith had issued her, her tusks showing. She had not filed them, had never filed them, would not, and she was carrying a guard's communicator, and the small metal tool she'd spent 11 days making and nothing else. To any observer who was not looking carefully, she could have been a maintenance contractor moving between jobs. The trick was to be someone who belonged, not someone who was trying not to be noticed. The people who tried not to be noticed were always the most visible. She needed a ship. The tier had 6 docking berths currently occupied. She assessed them in approximately 4 seconds, reading hull class and drive signature from the visual cues she had spent a career learning. The long-haul freighter in berth 1, old but solid, almost certainly with a crew aboard. The 2 Velkith military scouts in berths 2 and 3, fast but registered in the military system and flagged the moment they lifted. The diplomatic shuttle in berth 4, which would get her killed at the first checkpoint. The decommissioned survey vessel in berth 5 that was sitting on its landing struts with its running lights in standby mode. Alone, quiet, patient. Berth 5. Survey vessels had deep-range navigation systems and minimal identification beacons, because their whole operational purpose was to go places without being noticed. They also typically had manual override capability on their drive systems, because they operated in regions too remote for automated troubleshooting. And they were, almost always, undermanned skeleton crew at most, often a single pilot on an extended research posting who spent most of their time asleep. She was already walking toward it. She hit the access ramp of berth 5 at a measured pace and slapped the crew hatch with an open palm. Locked. She pressed her ear to it and heard the interior hum of a ship on standby power. No movement, crew either ashore or genuinely asleep. She had the metal tool in her hand. Survey vessels used a standard galactic registry hatch lock, the same model she'd bypassed 3 times in her reconnaissance years. This one took her 40 seconds, which she considered acceptable given that she was working by feel with a tool not designed for this purpose, and could hear, now, the distant sound of an alert tone beginning somewhere in the lower tiers. The hatch opened. The ship's interior was dim and smelled like long-haul boredom, stale coffee equivalent, lubricant, old spacer's wool that had been slept in too many times without washing, and she moved through it fast and quiet to the cockpit. 2 seats. She dropped into the primary. The instruments were older than her, but the layout was standard, and her hands found what they needed without hesitation, moving across the console with the muscle memory of years. Main drive, charging 30 seconds. Navigation. She input coordinates manually, working from the schematics and contact data she'd memorized 11 years ago and never once spoken aloud. A location called Barrack 7 on official charts, called Ironmaw's Tooth on every Orc navigation system that acknowledged it existed, tucked inside an asteroid cluster the Velkith had surveyed once, filed under resource spore and forgotten, and which her father's people had spent 40 years making into something the Velkith had no idea existed. The alert tone below was louder now. She could hear the specific pitch that meant localized, not station-wide. Someone had found the guard, not yet understood what had happened, not yet correlated. She had 2 minutes at most. She didn't look back. She engaged the drive. She slept for the first time in 37 days. She woke to the navigation chime telling her she was 3 hours from the relay station, lying curled in the pilot's seat with her knees drawn up, and one hand still resting on the manual drive override because some part of her body had refused to entirely stop being vigilant, even unconscious. That part of her had kept watch through the transit. She appreciated it. She ate what was in the survey vessel's stores. Not much crackers, some kind of processed protein brick that tasted like industrial polymer and salt, a water reclamation bladder, but she ate it all slowly, methodically, and felt the slow return of herself. The return of weight to her limbs. The return of warmth to her core. The return of the specific kind of clarity that only came when the body had enough fuel to stop screaming and start thinking. She looked at her hands. They were calloused and thin from the weeks in the cell, and they bore the small, precise cuts of her work on the conduit wall. She turned them over in the pale cockpit light, studying the damage with the dispassionate attention of a surveyor examining terrain. Her knuckles were raw. The skin on her forearm had blistered from the channel heat and begun to heal in the way that skin did when it had been doing it for 43 years, knowing the process, not panicking. The cuts on her fingers had started to close. She thought about her father's hands. They had been enormous, the size of dinner plates, the color of dark earth, and they had held her with an exactness she had never been able to account for in a man that large. Not careful exactly, careful was the wrong word. It implied fragility, but precise. He had touched things with precision, had lifted her onto his shoulders precisely, had set her down precisely, had gripped her shoulder when she was old enough for it instead of picking her up. He had been a man who understood the difference between force and intention. She had believed for years, had needed to believe, that she was carrying his story forward. That command, rank, service, advancement, these were ways of honoring him, of justifying what had been done to him by building something inside the structure that had done it. She had climbed the Velkith military apparatus with the specific purpose of reaching a height from which she could do something useful, had been patient, had been strategic, had played for 11 years the long game that he had never quite gotten to play. What she understood now in the quiet of a stolen ship was that he had never been a symbol to himself. He had been a man who pressed his daughters back against his chest during thunderstorms and counted. 1, 2, 3. The storm is just air. You are Ironmaw. He had not survived 3 purges by becoming what they needed him to be. He had survived them by knowing, very clearly, what he needed himself to be. She sat with that for a while, let it settle into the new spaces the 37 days had made in her. Then she ran a scan of the ship's cargo hold, habit, thoroughness. She always wanted a full picture of her resources and found something she had not expected. The cargo manifest listed standard survey equipment, geological sampling arrays, atmospheric processors, routine materiel for a long-haul research posting in the outer systems. What the cargo hold actually contained was a significant quantity of unmarked medical supplies, crated under a survey equipment false label, and in a sealed container in the aft section, something that her scanner identified as restricted Velkith biological material of the classification type, associated with genetic alteration research. She sat very still. She looked at the container's manifest code. She ran it against the classification index in the ship's database. She cross-referenced it with the restricted access codes she had memorized in her last days of freedom, the ones that had required 3 levels of clearance she'd spent 2 years accumulating access to. She sat very still for a long time. The Velkith had a program. Everyone in the Dominion's military apparatus had heard the rumors about what happened to species that proved problematic, species that maintained cultural cohesion under integration pressure, species that kept having children who remembered what their grandparents had been. There were words for it in the classified documents she had been cleared to read in her final year of service: Population Stabilization Initiative, Adaptive Integration Facilitation, Controlled Variation Management. The mutant protocols. She had heard the rumors, and she had, in the way that people inside systems of power heard uncomfortable truths, categorized them as exaggerated, as the rhetoric of the dispossessed, as probably true in principle but not this systematic. She had told herself that she was working towards something, that there was a difference between the institution and its worst elements, that from inside you could change things that from outside you could only shout about. In front of her was a sealed container full of evidence that the worst elements were the institution, that this was not an excess, that it was a policy. She looked at the container for a long time. Then she looked at the navigation readout. She had 2 hours and 40 minutes before arrival at Ironmaw's Tooth. She opened a channel on the tight beam frequency she had memorized. No Velkith registry, no intercept signature, the private frequency her father's network had used and which she had assumed until this moment was mostly a nostalgic remnant, and began transmitting. Not just her position. Everything. The relay station was called Barrack 7 on official charts and Ironmaw's Tooth on every Orc navigation system that acknowledged it existed. It occupied a region of space the Velkith had surveyed once, filed under resource bore and navigable hazard and no strategic value, and what they had missed was that the asteroid cluster it inhabited was full of hollow rocks, and hollow rocks, if you spent 40 years quietly improving them, were very useful things. She docked in the secondary bay, the one that didn't appear on the bay registry, which her father's people had built knowing that someday someone would arrive in a borrowed ship and need to not be officially recorded. And the landing struts had barely settled when the bay door opened and people came down the corridor. She had expected remnants of the Ironmaw network, older veterans, people who had been maintaining the Tooth in her father's name, with diminishing resources and increasing anxiety. What she found, 3 Orc veterans she recognized, 2 humans she did not. She had not expected humans. She stood at the base of her ramp and looked at them with the careful, total assessment of someone who had just spent 37 days in a hole and was operating at a heightened awareness of what things were and were not as presented. The older of the 2 humans stepped forward, medium height, built like someone who had been maintaining fitness for a long time without access to good equipment, functional, not aesthetic, the kind of body that told you about habits rather than intentions. Gray-streaked hair cropped short, a face that had been through something. Scar tissue in the specific pattern that Persia associated with people who had survived things they had not been prepared to survive. The small-scale healing of 100 minor injuries accumulated over years, rather than the dramatic statement of a single wound. His hands were open and visible. He was carrying nothing. "Commander Ironmaw," he said, in Galactic Common. "I'm Lieutenant Garrett Solon, Federation-aligned independent fleet, currently operating under no flag at all." He paused. "I want to say that we're glad you're alive, which is true. I also want to be honest that we've been waiting for you to either escape or die for the past 6 weeks, because Your disappearance into that facility was the single most disruptive thing that has happened to the Anti-Dominion intelligence network in 3 years, and we have been in an increasingly uncomfortable holding pattern since. She looked at him. "You've been waiting," she said. "We weren't certain you'd come out. No one had from that facility. No one had tried from the inside of the conduit channel." He processed this. "Is that how?" "Yes." He glanced at his companion, the second human, younger, with the restless, cataloging eyes of someone who spent a lot of time watching things for signs of threat, and then back to her. "The data you transmitted on approach. We've been running it against our own intelligence since you came in range. And it's significant," he said. "More than significant. It confirms things we suspected about the protocols. Things that, transmitted to the right people at the right moment through the right channels, could change the terms of engagement for every non-Velkith species in Dominion space." "I know," she said. "You've had what, 3 hours in transit to?" 2 hours and 40 minutes, she said. "I know. Tell me what you need and tell me what you have, and then we'll talk about what we can do." The station's common room was utilitarian, in the way of things built by people who understood that ornamentation required resources better spent on insulation and drive maintenance. Bare polymer walls over exposed rock, a table bolted to the floor, chairs that had been chosen for durability. But someone had put a kettle on, and there was something hot in a cup in front of Persia, and she held it in both hands and let the warmth work into her palms while Solon laid out the picture. The picture was not good. The Velkith Dominion had been expanding its mutant protocols from the outer systems toward the inner territories for the past 2 years. The program had moved from experimental to operational. 3 non-Velkith species had already been subjected to forced genetic alteration programs in deployment-scale trials. 2 of them had survived in altered forms. 1 had not survived at all, and the Dominion's records classified the outcome as a containment success. The intelligence network that Solon represented, a loose coalition of free species advocates, former Dominion military defectors, Human Federation operatives, who had gone officially dark when the Federation's neutrality position calcified into something indistinguishable from complicity, had been working for 3 years to gather evidence, had been waiting for a moment when the evidence was substantial enough, specific enough, credible enough, to break through the Dominion's information control and reach the populations whose lives were at stake. They had most of the evidence. What they had not had was a carrier. Someone with enough surviving credibility among both Orc populations and the broader interspecies community to transmit the information in a way that would be believed, would not be instantly characterized as enemy propaganda, would not disappear into the Velkith suppression apparatus before it reached anyone who could act on it. The daughter of Drek Ironmaw escaped from the Undercroft, carrying primary physical evidence, speaking in her own voice. That was not nothing. That was potentially everything. "You need me to be a symbol," Persia said. Solon shook his head slightly. "I need you to be a transmitter, whether that." "No," she set down the cup. "I understand what you're describing. You need a face the broadcast can carry." An Orc commander, survivor of the Undercroft, daughter of Drek Ironmaw, carrying primary evidence on the mutant protocols. That's a symbol. A deliberate one. I'm not saying I won't do it. I'm saying I want to be clear about what we're doing and why. He was quiet for a moment. "What's the distinction for you?" She thought about her father, about what he had said once, when she was old enough to understand politics, and had asked him why he kept serving a court that had taken everything from his people. "Because the ones still in the holds are watching," he'd said. "And if I walk out, they see their general walk out. If I stay and fight from inside, they see their general not break. Symbols matter. I just refuse to be only a symbol." "A symbol stops when the story is done," she said. "A transmitter keeps going." So we do this broadcast and then we keep going. We build on it. We don't win one news cycle and call it finished. Solon looked at her for a long time with the expression of someone recalibrating, something important. That's essentially what I've been saying to my own people for 3 years, he said, and none of them have put it that simply. You've been working with humans for 3 years, she said, without malice. Humans overcomplicate things. The second human operative, the younger one with the surveillance eyes, whose name turned out to be Danish Akafer, communications technician, Federation trained and independently motivated, made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Can you get us a broadcast channel that the Dominion can't close inside of 30 minutes? Persia asked him. He thought about it with the speed of someone who had been thinking about this problem for a long time and had answers ready. 22 minutes is realistic. 30 is optimistic. The suppression algorithms are adaptive, and they learn the architecture of a channel in real time, so 22 minutes is enough. She looked at Solon. Is your evidence package ready to transmit? We've been building it for 3 years. Good, add what I brought in. She stood up. And let's talk about who we're sending it to. They worked for 18 hours straight. Persia did not sleep. She had slept on the ship and it would have to be enough. She sat at the communications console with Danish and went through the evidence package piece by piece, adding context and annotation, adding the data from the cargo hold, adding the testimony she had composed during 2 hours and 40 minutes of transit, dates, coordinates, the specific classification codes on the biological containers, the chain of custody she had personally witnessed from acquisition to custody to what she now understood was distribution for deployment. Around the 12th hour, one of the Orc veterans brought her food. She ate without looking away from the console. Around the 16th hour, she stopped and put her hands flat on the table and breathed, in through the nose, count to 6, out through the mouth, count to 8. Her hands were still thin. The cuts were still there. The blistered forearm had stiffened overnight, and she rotated the joint slowly, maintaining its range of motion. Danish looked at her sideways. He had been working with the focused efficiency of someone who understood what was at stake and had decided not to look at it directly. She recognized the strategy. "You okay?" he said. "Yes. You've been at this for..." "I know how long I've been at this." She turned her head to look at him properly. He was maybe 28. He had a specific kind of tiredness around his eyes that came not from physical exertion, but from caring about something too much for too long without resolution. She knew that tiredness from the mirror. "How did you end up out here?" He was quiet for a moment, the quiet of someone deciding how much of a thing to tell. "The Federation's official position is neutrality," he said finally. "My actual position is that neutrality is what you call it when you've decided your comfort is more important than someone else's survival." She nodded. "My mother is Terranork," he added. "Hybrid classified. Under the mutant protocols she'd be considered a..." He stopped, breathed, finished in a different tone. So, she said. She put her hand on his shoulder briefly, the way her father had done when she was old enough that comfort would have felt condescending, but presence still meant something. Just acknowledging that she had heard him and that it mattered. Then she turned back to the console. "Let's finish this," she said. The broadcast went out at the start of the 19th hour. Danish had spent 3 years building the transmission architecture for this specific moment. 17 simultaneous burst points, each routing through a different relay structure, each aimed at a different audience, all of them firing in the same half-second window to prevent the Dominion suppression systems from using early intercept data to close the later ones. The Barak holds, the Free Species Assembly, the 3 non-Velkith species currently under protocol targeting, 7 Human Federation independent systems whose governments had been pushing for a neutrality revision. 6 major multi-species information networks that the Velkith couldn't close without triggering a sovereignty crisis. They weren't ready for. The broadcast led with Persia's face. Not in armor, not with weapons, not performing anything. Just her face, the tusk she had never filed, the scars from the purge she had survived at 14, the 37 days of the Undercroft visible in the hollows of her cheekbones, and the specific, absolute steadiness of her eyes and her voice, which was not loud and was not emotional, which was the voice of someone reading navigation coordinates, precise and unhurried and completely certain. She said her name. She said her father's name. She said what she had seen in the Undercroft and what she had found in the cargo hold of a survey vessel in the orbital docking tier of Keth Primaris, and she said it the way she had done everything since the crack in the north wall, methodically, carefully, accountably, not as accusation, as record. The Velkith closed it down in 19 minutes. 3 minutes short of Danish's estimate. He took it personally. But the burst transmissions had replicated across 14 independent servers and 3 isolated networks in the first 6 minutes, and the suppression algorithms were 17 seconds too late on the barrack hold channel. The one that mattered most, the one where the people who had been watching their general for 11 years received confirmation of what they had already known and been waiting to hear confirmed. That she was alive. That she had not broken. That the thing done to them was documented. The station went quiet after the broadcast closed, not the silence of failure, the silence of something finished and something else beginning. The hold's network is moving, Solon said from the communications console 3 hours later. Persia was at the secondary terminal running contact protocols for the Free Species Assembly, but she heard him. "I know," she said. "I've been on with them since the replication confirmed." The news had reached the asteroid warrens where the barrack hold population lived, had been living more precisely, in the layered, complicated way of a people who had learned over generations to construct a life inside the space a conquering empire left unoccupied, and it had found them prepared. Not roused, not awakened from passivity, prepared. The way that Orcs understood preparation, which was the way they understood everything, not as a moment but as a practice. A sustained coiling of energy that looked like stillness to anyone watching from outside. They had been watching Persia for 11 years, watching her climb inside the structure that had consumed her father, watching her serve a court she had caused to despise, watching her be measured and careful and strategic. And they had not judged this. They had understood it as the thing it was, because they were a people who had survived by understanding the difference between an accommodation that preserved you and an accommodation that erased you. They had known she had not been erased. When the broadcast reached them, what they heard in her voice was exactly what she had meant them to hear, not survival, which they had already counted on, but completion. The calculation finished, the result transmitted. The response, when it came, was the specific, organized, unhurried movement of a people who had been prepared for a long time and were now simply beginning. "There's something else," Solon said. She looked up. "One of the Velkith military vessels that was docked at Keth Primaris when you left, the interdiction net has picked up its drive signature. Running dark. We have a thermal trace." He paused. "Trajectory consistent with this system." She processed this. "How long?" 14 hours, maybe 16 if they're being careful." "They'll be careful," she said. 14. She leaned back and looked at the ceiling, bare polymer over rock, the honest materials of a place built to last rather than impress, and turned the problem over. 14 hours. The broadcast had gone out. The replication was beyond full suppression. The evidence was in independent hands. The holds were moving. The assembly had 2 council members requesting a secure session. Everything she had set out to do from the crack in the north wall, she had done. The question was what came next. She thought about the 4 variables she had not accounted for before the escape, the ones she had told herself she'd handle as they came. She had handled all four. Not perfectly. The shoulder was going to bruise spectacularly, and the technician might have made her communicator call before reaching 1,000, but handled. The next problem had its own number. She would count them. Solon, she said. Yes. What's the range on the station's type beam array? He told her. She nodded, turned it over. And the survey vessel I came in on, what are the drive specs? She paused, and asked Danish to come in. I have a problem with approximately 20 variables and he's useful. Solon went. She turned back to the terminal. The assembly session request was blinking. The Hold's network had a second transmission waiting. The evidence she had broadcast was replicating beyond the Velkith's reach, spreading into the information ecosystems of 6 independent systems at the speed of light, finding audiences that had been waiting for something they could hold. She put her hands flat on the console, felt the hum of the station through her palms, a different vibration than the resonance lock, a different frequency entirely. But she had learned to read vibration. You could always tell, if you had paid enough attention, whether a thing was opening or closing. This one was opening. She thought about her father's hands, about the storm is just air, about Ironmaw doesn't break indoors, about the crack in the north wall that had been there all along, waiting for someone patient enough to find it. She breathed once, in through the nose, count to 6. Then she began. 6 weeks later, the Free Species Assembly voted to formally request an independent investigation into the Velkith mutant protocols by a margin of 11 votes. 7 of those 11 votes came from member species who had cited the Ironmaw broadcast as the tipping point in their deliberations. The Velkith Dominion issued a statement categorizing the broadcast as falsified enemy propaganda, and the vote as a violation of the Dominion's internal sovereignty. The statement was ignored by 8 of the 11 voting species, and partially ignored by the remaining 3. 14 Velkith military vessels were repositioned to the Barak Hold cluster within 72 hours of the Assembly vote. The reposition was logged in the Public Transit Registry, which was unusual. Velkith military movements were typically dark. The logging was interpreted, by every analyst Persia spoke with, as a show of force intended to reassure the Dominion's internal political factions rather than a precursor to actual engagement. They had too many variables in play for engagement. They were, for the first time in 300 years, caught between positions they had designed to be mutually reinforcing, and which were now pulling against each other. Persia received this analysis in a secure session at a location she did not name to anyone who did not already know it. She listened to all of it carefully, made notes in the margin of her thinking, and asked 3 questions that the analysts had not previously been asked, and that required a week of additional work to answer properly. Then she began planning the next step. She was not a symbol, she was a transmitter, she was the architect. She was, at 43 years old, barefoot on the floor of a hidden station inside a hollow rock, in a region of space. A galactic empire had filed under no strategic value, the last daughter of a man who had pressed her back against his chest during a storm and told her that the storm was just air. The Velkith were not just air. But they had made the same mistake every force made when it decided that size was strategy and patience was weakness. They had looked at the crack in the wall and not seen the architect kneeling in front of it. She picked up the communicator. She began. The secure session with the Free Species Assembly Council members took place over Typebeam, encoded on 3 rotating frequencies that Danish ran simultaneously in case one was penetrated. Persia sat in the communications room with a cup of something hot and a list of things she intended to say. The 2 council members were of different species, one Quelith, one Rithani, and they were both experienced enough politicians to have reached the Assembly's inner council, which meant they were experienced enough to be cautious. The first 12 minutes of the session were the specific kind of careful conversation that people have when everyone present knows what is being discussed, and everyone present is also cataloging the exits. Persia waited through the 12 minutes. She did not rush them. She had spent 37 days in a cell in the dark. She had patience in quantities these two politicians could not imagine. "The issue," the Quelith Council member said, finally, with the air of someone naming a problem they had been holding at arm's length, "is verification. The broadcast was compelling. The evidence package is compelling. But the Dominion has already issued a counter-narrative, and there are assembly members who are waiting for an independent forensic verification before they commit to a formal position." "How long does verification take?" Persia asked. "In ideal circumstances, 6 to 8 weeks. In these circumstances." A pause. "The Dominion will be applying pressure to every independent verification body we could reasonably use." "So the question," Persia said, "is not can the evidence be verified. It's whether the verification can be completed before the window closes. Before the Dominion manages to reframe this as a bilateral dispute rather than a systemic violation." "That is approximately the question, yes." She thought about the cargo hold of the survey vessel. She thought about the manifest codes, the classification indices, the chain of custody she had personally witnessed. She thought about what she had memorized in the last 48 hours of her freedom and why. "I have 3 additional data sets I didn't include in the broadcast," she said. "I didn't include them because they required context to be legible, and a broadcast is a blunt instrument. A verification proceeding is not." The Quelith Council member was quiet for a moment. "These data sets. The first is a communications intercept from the 2nd year of my command posting. I had clearance to access it through a joint intelligence review. The data itself came from a Velkith internal operations channel and describes the protocols in terms that make the broadcast evidence look like an understatement. The second is the personnel records of the survey vessel I arrived on, specifically the vessel's registered ownership chain, which terminates at a Velkith Strategic Research Office that officially does not exist. The third is testimony I can give personally, under any verification protocol you choose, about a specific briefing I attended in the 3rd year of my posting, where the protocols were described to senior officers by name, in operational terms, and I was the only non-Velkith officer in the room." A longer silence. "You've been carrying this," the Rithani Council member said. "It was not quite a question." "Since the day I understood what I was looking at," Persia said, "which was approximately 6 months before my name appeared on the loyalty review list. I didn't have a verification body to take it to that the Dominion couldn't close. I didn't have a transmission channel that would survive suppression. What I had was memory and patience and the understanding that the moment would come. And now it has." "And now it has," she agreed. She submitted the 3 additional data sets to the verification, proceeding through an encrypted relay that Danish spent 4 hours building specifically for this transfer, and then dismantled immediately after. She did it not because she was afraid fear was not the operative thing, but because she was meticulous. You did not survive 37 days in the dark by cutting corners on the small procedures. The small procedures were what the large outcomes were built from. After the transfer, she stood outside the station in the Bay Corridor, which had a small viewport looking out into the asteroid cluster, and she watched the rock. It was not dramatic rock. It did not have the imposing scale of geological formations meant to be seen from a distance. It was close and quiet and unexceptional, the matte gray of old stone, pitted with impact craters too small to be interesting, hovering in the slow drift of a cluster whose orbital mathematics had not changed in 4 billion years. The Velkith had surveyed it and found it empty and moved on. Her father had looked at the same cluster 40 years ago and seen something else. Not a rock, a hollow, something you could make a place inside of if you were patient enough to hollow it. She thought she understood now what he had meant when he had said that Iron Maw doesn't break indoors. She had always taken it as a statement about endurance, about the specific orc capacity to absorb pressure without shattering, which was real and which she had spent 37 days demonstrating. But there was a second layer to it. You don't break indoors because breaking indoors left your pieces in a contained space with no room to fall. Breaking indoors meant staying broken. Iron Maw survived by not staying still, by not accepting the boundaries of the space it was given, by finding the crack in the north wall of every room it was locked inside and working at it until it opened. She turned away from the viewport. Kethra was in the corridor with a second cup of something hot, and the knowing expression of someone who had been watching the Iron Maw line for long enough to know what the viewport moments looked like, and what came after them. "The assembly session," Persia said. "Finished. Danish is logging the confirmation. And Solon, running the interdiction vessel analysis. He thinks they're going to hold at the outer marker until they have clearer intelligence on what's inside the cluster." She took the cup, held it. The warmth worked into her palms. "They'll send a scout first." He thinks so too. "The scout will confirm we're here. Then they'll have a decision to make, which is the same decision they've been trying to avoid, which is whether to commit forces against a civilian station that is now actively part of a verification proceeding recognized by the Assembly." She paused. "That decision is significantly more complicated for them than it would have been 72 hours ago." Kethra made the sound that was the orc equivalent of a laugh. 72 hours ago you were in a cell." "Yes," Persia said, "which means 72 hours ago they had already made the easier decision. They chose the cell over engagement because engagement was complicated. They've been choosing the path of least immediate complication for 11 years. She drank from the cup. "The problem with that strategy is that it requires your opponent to also choose the path of least complication. Otherwise, every deferred complication just accumulates into something bigger. And you are an accumulated complication," she said. "Yes." Kethra gave her the look that Persia had been receiving from Kethra since she was 7 years old, which was the specific combination of exasperation and satisfaction that meant Kethra was thinking about Drek Iron Maw and seeing the resemblance. She had always found this look both aggravating and steadying. She suspected it would continue to be both for whatever years she had remaining. The scout arrived in the system at the start of the third day. Small vessel, tight profile, running dark in the standard Velkith reconnaissance configuration that Persia had spent 6 years learning to detect and counter. It came in on the long arc approach, skimming the outer edge of the asteroid cluster, trying to resolve the interior without penetrating the rock screen. Danish had the sensors running on the station's exterior array, which he had spent a day calibrating for exactly this possibility, and he tracked the scout's passage with the attentive care of a man who understood that information was the difference between a 14-hour problem and a 4-hour problem. "They got resolution on the docking bay," he said. "The survey vessel." "Expected," Persia said. "They ran it against the registry." He paused. "They know it's the Keth Primaris vessel, so they know you're here." "Also expected." "They're transmitting back to the main vessel." He watched the console. "The main vessel has gone to active sensors." Persia looked at the tactical display. The main interdiction vessel, sitting at the outer marker of the system, had been running dark since arrival. Active sensors meant it was now broadcasting its presence deliberately. A message to the station: "We know you're there, and we know you know we know." "What's the Assembly's verification timeline?" she asked. Council member Veloci confirmed acceptance of the 3 supplemental data sets 4 hours ago, Danish said. "Preliminary verification proceeding is officially open." "That's on the public record as of," he checked, 2 hours and 17 minutes ago. "So any action the Dominion takes against this station, is now an action against a party to an official assembly verification proceeding. Technically, yes. Technically is good enough. She looked at the tactical display again. The interdiction vessel had not moved. They're waiting for orders, which means someone in the command structure is asking exactly the question I described to Kethra, which is whether the cost of action here is lower than the cost of what's already in motion. She paused. And they're going to reach the same conclusion they always reach when the calculation is genuinely unclear to them, which is that they need more information before they commit. How long does that buy us? Long enough. She stood up. Run the verification data package on the public relay, all of it that's publicly cleared. I want the Dominion's command calculating with accurate information about what has already escaped the bottle. Danish ran it. The interdiction vessel held position. It held position for 9 hours. Then, at the start of the 9th hour, its drive signature shifted, not to approach, but to a holding pattern that suggested it was waiting for instructions that had not yet arrived. Political instructions. The kind that required consultation up the chain to a level where the implications of the action were being weighed against the implications of inaction, where someone senior enough to authorize the use of force against a station connected to an active assembly proceeding was sitting in a room somewhere on Keth Primaris and doing exactly the arithmetic that Persia had been designing for them. She did not celebrate. She had been in enough situations to know that a held position was not a solution. It was a deferred variable, one she had created the conditions for, not resolved. But deferred variables had their uses. They bought the space to work in. They bought the time for the evidence to replicate further, for the assembly to build toward a formal position, for the populations that had seen the broadcast to begin the organized movements she could see on the network spreading like heat through cold stone. She returned to the communications console. She had 15 things to do before the station's next rotation. She began with the first. There is a particular quality of light on the Barak holds that exists nowhere else in explored space. The asteroid warrens are deep and old, and the bioluminescent organisms the orc populations have cultivated over generations run in great slow rivers along the rock faces, green and amber, and the specific pale blue that means the organisms are in their feeding cycle. And the light they produce is not bright, but it is everywhere, soft and pervasive, the light of a place that has decided to keep itself warm in the dark from the inside out. Persia had not seen it in 11 years. She saw it now in the video relay from the Hold's network, the live feed from the public gathering spaces where the population of the Warrens had come out of their daily routines and were standing in the bioluminescent light discussing what had happened, what was continuing to happen. She watched small figures in the ambient glow of a home she had left and not returned to, and she thought about her father, who had spent the last years of his life working to preserve the conditions for exactly this. A people who knew what they were, in a place that could hold them. He had not, as far as she knew, ever intended her to spend a month in a Velkith dungeon, but he had prepared her for it, had spent her childhood teaching her the breathing and the patience, and the understanding that the storm was just air, had spent her adolescence showing her what it looked like when a person did not break on principle rather than by luck, had spent the years she had with him. Not enough, never enough. They had been cut at 11 years ago with the specific brutality of a thing cut before it was finished, building in her the architecture of someone who could work on a crack in a wall for 19 days and still believe it would open. She thought it would have been useful to tell him that it opened. She thought he probably already knew, not in the mystical sense, which she did not place much weight on, but in the sense that the things you build in another person continue after you, that the architecture was still standing, that the hollow rock was still there, that the light was still running in green-amber rivers along the cave walls. Commander. She did not look away from the relay. Yes. Solon was behind her. She could hear him choosing his words. The Assembly has issued a preliminary statement, calling for all parties to maintain positions while the verification proceeds. It's not binding, but it's public. Yes. She finally turned. He was holding a tablet with the statement pulled up, and his face had the expression of someone who was trying not to project something onto an outcome that was still in motion, which she respected. It's a foundation, she said, not an outcome. I know, he stopped. 3 years. We've been building towards something like this for 3 years, and it keeps feeling like we're one step behind. And this is the first time in 3 years that something has happened that I didn't design and that I couldn't have predicted, and that is moving faster than I can track. She looked at him steadily. That feeling is what winning looks like in the early stages, not clarity, acceleration. She paused. The Velkith have spent 300 years in a system they built and understand. They are very good at fighting in that system. What they are not good at is responding to things that move outside their frame. They categorized us incorrectly. They categorized the holds incorrectly. They categorized you and your network incorrectly. The acceleration you're feeling is what happens when something that should have been contained wasn't. He was quiet. Next 3 weeks are going to be harder than the last 3 years, she said. The Dominion is going to make decisions that look like overreach. They are going to make them because their frame is telling them that force resolves these problems and they have not yet updated the frame. We need to be in positions that turn every overreach into more evidence, more testimony, more assembly votes. She looked at the tablet in his hand. Start with the preliminary statement. Build the response network around it. And tell Danish, I want the supplemental data package, publicly released at the maximum rate the suppression architecture can't close fast enough to prevent. He took this in. You have a plan, he said. I have 47 variables mapped and 4 I'll handle as they come, she said. I've been here before. It's a workable position. He almost smiled, not quite. The situation was not quite smiling material, but almost. She turned back to the relay. In the bioluminescent light of the barrack holds, a people who did not break were beginning. She breathed once, in through the nose, count to 6. She began.